Most of the books in the New Testament tell us who wrote them. One interesting exception is the book of Hebrews. Tertullian thought that Barnabas wrote it. Martin Luther suggested that it might have been Apollos. Others have suggested Luke or Paul or Priscilla. In the end, it's safest to agree with the early church father Origen, who said, "Who wrote it? Only God knows." This is the last video in our Genesis to Jesus story set. To wrap things up, I'd like to read you a passage from the book of Hebrews that looks at the question, what is faith? What is faith? It's the confident assurance that what we hope for will happen. It's the evidence of things that we can't yet see. It's what God commended the people of old for. By faith we understand that the universe was created at God's command, that what we now see didn't come from things that can be seen. It was by faith that Abel brought God a more acceptable offering than Cain did. And God commended Abel for his faith and accepted his offering to show that he was right with God. And even though he's long dead, Abel still speaks to us because of his faith. It was by faith that Enoch was taken from this life without dying. He just disappeared because God took him. But before he was taken, God commended him, saying, "I'm pleased with him." And without faith, it's impossible to please God, because anyone who wants to come to God must believe that God exists and that God rewards those who sincerely seek him. It was by faith that Noah obeyed God when he warned him about something never seen before. Noah built an ark to save his family, thus condemning the world and inheriting the gift of being right with God. It was by faith that Abraham obeyed God when he called him to go to a land that would someday become his inheritance. Abraham went even though he didn't know where he was going. By his faith, he lived in the land that God had promised him, but in a tent like a foreigner. It was the same with Isaac and Jacob, who inherited the same promise. Abraham did this because he was confidently looking forward to a city built on eternal foundations, designed and built by God himself. It was by faith that Abraham and Sarah were able to have a child, even though he was too old and she was barren. Because Abraham trusted God to keep his promises. And so Abraham, who was as good as dead, from him came more descendants than you can count, like the stars in the sky and the sand on the sea. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They didn't receive what God had promised, but they saw it from a distance and welcomed God's promises. They acknowledged that they were no more than foreigners and nomads here on earth, and people who talk like that show that they're looking forward to a country they can call their own. If they'd been thinking of the old country, they would have found a way to go back, but they were looking forward to a better country, a heavenly homeland. That's why God's not ashamed to call himself their God. He's even prepared a heavenly city for them. It was by faith that Abraham offered Isaac to God when God tested him. Abraham had received God's promises, and he was ready to sacrifice his only son Isaac, even though God had promised him that it's through Isaac that his descendants would be counted. Abraham figured that if Isaac died, God was able to bring him back to life. And, in a sense, Abraham did receive his son back from the dead. It was by faith that Isaac blessed his two sons, Jacob and Esau, for their future. It was by faith that Jacob, when he was old and dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons while he worshipped as he leant on his staff. And it was by faith that Joseph, when he was about to die, said confidently that one day God would rescue the Israelites from Egypt. He was so confident that he commanded his descendants to carry his bones with them when they left. It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after his birth. They saw that he was no ordinary child, and they weren't afraid of what the king would do. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be known as the son of the king's daughter. He chose to be oppressed along with God's people, rather than enjoying the pleasures of sin. he realized that suffering for the sake of God's promised king was better than having all the treasures owned by Egypt's king. He was looking forward to God's great reward. It was by faith that Moses left Egypt. He wasn't afraid of the king. He kept going because he had his eyes fixed on the one who can't be seen. It was by faith that Moses told the Israelites to sprinkle blood on the doorposts of their houses so that God would not kill their firstborn sons. It was by faith that the Israelites passed through the Red Sea on dry ground, but when the Egyptians tried to follow them, they were drowned. It was by faith that they marched around Jericho for 7 days, and the city walls came down. It was by faith that Rahab the prostitute welcomed the Israelite spies, and therefore didn't die with the rest of Jericho who disobeyed God. Do I need to say more? I don't have time to tell you all about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and all of the other prophets who by faith conquered kingdoms, ruled justly, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, they quenched furious flames, and they escaped death by the sword. Their weakness was turned into strength. They became powerful in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back from the dead. Others were tortured and refused to be released because they preferred to die as a captive than turn away from God. Some were mocked and cut with whips, while others were chained up and thrown into prison. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. They went around in sheepskins and goatskins, hungry and oppressed and mistreated. This world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, in caves and holes in the ground. All of them were commended for their faith, yet none of them received what God had promised. For God had planned something better for us, so that we and them together will receive the prize at the end of the race. Therefore, since we're surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses, let's strip off everything that hinders us, especially the sin that so easily entangles. And let's run with endurance the race that God has marked out for us. Let's fix our eyes on Jesus, who started our faith and who completes our faith. For the joy that he could see ahead of him, he endured a shameful death on the cross. But now, he's seated in the position of honor at the right-hand side of God's throne in heaven. Think about Jesus, who endured the opposition of sinful people. Then, you won't grow weary and give up. So that concludes our Genesis to Jesus story set. If you haven't already done so and it's still 2014, don't forget to fill out the viewer survey. Next Monday, we're going to have the first video in a special set of videos in the lead up to Christmas. See you then on Storytime with Josh.